Daughter of Discord, prequel to Star MAGE Saga. Written by J.J. Green, AI narrated. Offworld raiders test a young girl's courage. Carina Lin's life has never been easy. Forced to hide her true identity as a star mage, she and her grandmother barely get by, scraping a living on a poor backwater planet. But things are about to get a whole lot harder. Her slum settlement is attacked, and she faces a terrible dilemma. Help her neighbors and risk revealing her powers, or do nothing and leave them to die. Chapter 1. A battle had broken out, and it was up to Carina Lin to stop it. Scalabites had escaped their enclosure and were driving through hastily assembled Kruken ranks. Sprays of acid arched from Kruken's mouths, but the attackers were barely affected as the Scalabites methodically tore their ancient enemies apart. Surprised and all but defenseless, the Krukens were suffering heavy losses. Pieces of carapace were scattered across a wide area, along with the remains of articulated limbs still twitching. Spatters of white blood and green goo festooned the walls. It was a massacre. Carina traced the Scalabite line back to where they had eaten through their enclosure wall. She stuffed a rag in the gap. Though it wouldn't hold the insects forever, it would do for the moment. 6 times she made the trip. On the 7th turn, only a few Scalabites remained. The Krukens were overwhelming the stragglers, shooting jets of acid that scored their shells. Was it kinder to leave the last few Scalabites to a quick death, or return them to safety, where they might linger for days? She bit her lip. She picked out the few who were still moving, grasping their legs between her fingers and thumbs, and carried them over to their enclosure. But when she put them down, their fellows immediately set upon them and ate them. She decided to leave the rest of the ones in the Kruken station to their fate. Squatting down, she examined the hole Scalabites had gnawed in their enclosure wall. Her grandma called her from the front of the shop. She frowned. She couldn't leave her pets right now. If she did, the Scalabites might eat through the rag and escape again.
May, come here.
In a minute.
What's that?
The old woman's voice rose in outrage.
Carina Lin, come here immediately.
She didn't reply, buying just a little more time as she sprayed quick-dry resin over the hole in the Scalabite's home. Within seconds, her grandmother jerked aside the curtain, separating the front and back of the shop. Though the old woman only stood 140 centimeters tall, she was a formidable sight. Metal pins stuck out of her severe black bun like daggers, and her worn plain clothes were stiff with starch. Even her flat cloth shoes seemed menacing as Carina watched them, not daring to meet the woman's eyes. Her thoughtless defiance melted like a snowflake next to a furnace. She jumped to attention, her chin on her chest and her hands at her sides. Though still only a child, she already towered over her father's mother, but she dared not even look down upon the woman's head. She firmly fixed her gaze on her own bare, dirty toes.
What are you wasting your time with back here? Why aren't you polishing stones like I told you? How do you expect my shop to support us when you fritter away your time with these useless bugs?
Sorry, Nai.
Are these insects going to bring us money? Is your apology going to put food on our table?
No, Nai.
The old woman clicked her tongue and gestured energetically in the direction of the curtain.
I have too many customers. Come out here and serve them before they tire of waiting and leave.
Carina nodded and followed as her grandmother returned to the shop front. But as she stepped through the doorway, a high-pitched whine filled the air. She clapped her hands over her ears. Her grandmother spun around to face her, terror in her face. She grabbed Carina's arm, her fingers digging painfully into her biceps. The last time the alarm had sounded, less than 2 years ago, a band of marauders had raided the slum settlement, looting and destroying wherever they went. The place had barely recovered from the attack, and now it was happening again. Her grandmother was already pulling her into the rear room.
We must get into the hideaway.
She resisted.
I don't want to hide. I want to fight. I want to help with the defense.
You're too young. Come with me, May. Now.
Grandmother was deceptively strong for her size, and her grip on Carina's arm was vice-like. She found herself being dragged along, her feet slipping on the worn floorboards. When they reached the back room, her grandmother released her and pushed aside a rug. Beneath it, a square door was set into the dirt floor. The old woman tugged on the ring at the center of the door.
Help me, child.
She only managed to lift the door a few centimeters. Carina hadn't given up her hope of fighting the invaders, but she couldn't leave Nai defenseless. She gripped the door edge and heaved it up. After the previous marauder attack, when they had luckily been away from town, searching for unusual stones in the wilderness, Nai and she had dug a small hole in the backroom floor. Empty and dark, it was barely large enough to hold them. She balked at the idea of crouching inside the cramped space for hours, listening to the attack and the marauders looting her grandmother's humble shop over their heads. Besides, if they both went into the hole, who would pull the rug over it to hide the door?
What are you waiting for? Get inside, quickly. They'll be here any minute.
Then the old woman caught the look in her granddaughter's eye.
Wait, what are you thinking? Don't you dare!
Not too roughly, Carina pushed the small woman into the hole. Nai tried to stand up, but she pressed down on the woman's bony shoulder, forcing her to crouch.
How dare you? Come inside here with me now.
Using her other hand, Carina lifted the door up and over her grandmother. It closed with a thump, muffling Nai's protests. She quickly dragged the rug over the hatch, but it lifted as her grandmother tried to push up the heavy door. Holding the door down with one foot, Carina stretched and grabbed the scalabite enclosure, drawing it over the rug. The plywood box would prevent her grandmother from opening the door easily. Before she left, however, she hesitated. Should she stay with her grandmother to protect her? But she could fight the attackers best if she wasn't hiding in the shop. She could already hear the whisper of pulse rifle rounds. Though she hated to leave Nai alone, the old woman was very capable of defending herself. She knelt on the rug and shouted at the floor.
Stay inside and don't make a sound. I'll be back as soon as I can. If you hear them coming, cast, okay? I'm sorry, I have to go.
She took a bottle of elixir from a table and dropped it down the front of her shirt. Her grandmother always carried hers on a string around her neck. As she rose to her feet, she heard a faint May. She went into the front of the shop, her jaw set. Outside, the screaming had begun. All the customers had run away, neglecting even to take the coins lying on the counter or their bags of highly polished pebbles. Carina went to the curtains separating the shop front from the street and opened them a slit. Outside, all was deserted. Not a soul could be seen in the dusty dirt road, and the windows of the old ramshackle single-story homes were empty. Distant shouting and the sound of pulse fire echoed through the empty space. She slipped out, but rather than running down the street in the direction of the fighting, she turned to scale the shop's rough wall, climbing up onto its corrugated roof, placing her feet carefully to tread only on the roof supports and avoid the flimsy covering. She stepped quickly toward the center of town. As she lightly ran over the rooftops, she retrieved the bottle of elixir from her shirt, lifted it to her lips, and pulled out the stopper with her teeth. She put the stopper in her pocket. Her casting skills were not yet on a par with her grandmother's, but she might be able to do the attackers some harm. However, she could not afford to be observed. If anyone from the settlement were to witness what she intended to do, both she and Nai would be at great risk. No one in the settlement knew she and her grandmother were mages. All her life, her grandmother had warned her that their neighbors wouldn't understand or tolerate their powers. She had impressed upon Carina that if she let out their secret, she might as well have signed their death warrants. Slavery and/or torture would be the best they could expect. Suddenly, from somewhere up ahead came a shriek that froze Carina's heart. She scanned the streets to find the source. She spotted it. A dark, blurred shape was lifting up a woman and carrying her away. The shape of the creature blinked briefly into focus before fading to a blur again. Hunched, dark gray, many-limbed. It was a region. Her guts twisted, and she thought she might vomit. The attackers were not regular marauders. The settlement stood little chance of surviving a region attack. The aliens could shift in time, a little into the past and the future. It made them hard to see, and it made them hard to see, and it meant they could predict their victims' next moves. What the creatures did with their victims, no one knew, but none had ever escaped a region ship. Their raids were devastating because they were difficult to hit with pulse rounds. The round had to hit at the exact moment the region existed in the present, or it passed through the target. From the flashes of light coming from doors and windows, it was clear the settlement's defenders were doing their best. But they were fighting a losing battle. Did the same targeting problem apply to a cast? She would soon find out. She ran on, her long legs carrying her from strut to strut where the corrugated roof panels overlapped. More regions appeared, carrying away victims. She mulled over which cast to make. She wasn't confident about transporting the creatures. They were large, there were too many of them, and they were moving fast. Besides, where would she transport them to? No matter how far away she put them, they would only come back. Could she lift them and let them fall? It would be more prudent to do something she was confident would work. Cries of pain and anger rose above the general tumult. In a nearby street, a father was in a tug-of-war with a region, each pulling on an arm of a wailing child. The alien solved its problem by letting go of the child and grabbing man and child, lifting the struggling humans onto its back. The pair bobbed oddly as they writhed and fought, and the alien momentarily disappeared and reappeared. Then they were gone. Indecision immobilized Carina. She had to do something. Anything. She lifted her elixir canister to her lips and swallowed a mouthful, grimacing at the taste of the bitter, sour liquid. She focused on her region and closed her eyes. The first cast that entered her mind was split. It might work. It would have to do. Exactly as her grandmother had taught her. She shut out all other thoughts, sounds, and feelings, and focused on mentally writing the character. The strokes formed in her mind's eye. They had to be completed perfectly. Each stroke performed in the correct order. Each line running in the correct direction. The character was drawn. She sent out the cast and opened her eyes. The region she'd targeted was now forcing down the door of a house. At first, nothing seemed to happen to it. She was about to take another sip of elixir and try something else. But then, as the region's dark form flickered into focus again, she spotted a small tear in its carapace. That was something, at least. Should she move closer or try a different cast? A second later, the region's back ripped open. Like overripe fruit bursting, dusty matter exploded through the opening and fell to the ground around the creature's many limbs. The alien collapsed, and the weird oscillations ceased. Briefly, the creature's lines were defined. Then it was gone. The cast had worked. But there were many regions, and her elixir bottle contained only 10 or 12 mouthfuls. Could she split more than one of them at once? She spied a large patch of darkness moving along a road. Altogether, the patch had to be 3 or 4 regions. After taking a large swallow of liquid, she closed her eyes once more. The split character remained fresh in her mind and was easier to draw the second time around. Her eyes flew open and she watched the dark patch. Within a few moments, the regions had erupted through their own backs and disappeared. She'd killed 3 or 4 at once. She quickly checked the reactions of the people of her settlement to what she'd done. It wouldn't do her much good if her secret were discovered, but no one seemed to have noticed her up on the roof or connected her with the dying aliens. Everyone was too busy fighting for their lives. Time for another cast. She took a drink of elixir, but before she could close her eyes, she spotted movement in her peripheral vision. To her left, twitching antennae were rising above the roof edge. A region had seen her and was climbing up to capture her. It was only 2 paces away. She wouldn't have time to cast before it reached her. She ran to the creature and aimed a kick at its head, but her boot sank into nothingness. A limb flashed up and fastened around her ankle, sending a strange pulsating sensation through her leg. She pulled away, but the off-timing of the creature as it moved through time was not sufficient to allow her to escape. She was dragged inexorably toward the roof edge. She overbalanced and dropped her elixir canister. Liquid spilled out as it hit the iron sheet. Throwing herself backward, she snatched up the container. Fighting the region's tug on her leg, she pulled the stopper out of her pocket and shoved it into the canister's neck. Just as she managed to slip the container into her shirt, the region pulled her down and onto its back. She screamed. The creature shifted its pincer grip from her leg to her waist and also grabbed her shoulder, tipping her to a horizontal position, facing downward. It felt like knives cutting into her flesh. She had only minutes to free herself, or she would be aboard the alien ship and on her way to whatever fate awaited. She struggled like a wild thing. Her life was important to her, but it was the thought of her grandmother trapped beneath the shop floor that made her fight her hardest. Then it came to her. In her terror of the beast, she'd forgotten that she'd only just sipped elixir. She might still be within the limited window of time to cast. She ceased fighting. To create the character in her mind, she needed calm and concentration. It would be hard to achieve the state while being carried to her probable death, but she had to try. She closed her eyes and breathed in slowly before releasing the breath in a long, soft sigh. Stroke by stroke, the character formed in her mind, black ink on a gently glowing background of silver, just as her grandmother had taught her. It was complete. She cast. Below her, a jagged opening formed in the region. She sank down. The pincers gripping her disappeared and the dusty innards of the creature puffed around her as it broke apart. With a thud, she hit the ground. What remained of the region's carapace crumbled while its legs jerked and twitched. As she leapt up, the creature faded to nothingness. She was in the town square, at the center of the attack. All around her, people were running, fleeing their hiding places as they were forced out. Pulse rounds hissed and whispered, occasionally hitting the invaders and scoring their dark shells. She licked dust from her lips, then spotted 2 regions bearing down on her. She bolted, heading for the nearest exit. The alley was familiar, but it led away from her grandmother's shop. She had to get back to Nai Nai. The townsfolk had put up a valiant fight, and her casts must have helped, but the regions were winning. They were spreading out from the settlement center and down the dirt streets leading to the poorer areas. They were heading toward Nai Nai's shop. She glanced over her shoulder and saw she was no longer pursued. The regions who had been chasing her must have diverted to slower prey. She grimaced wryly. Her long years of practice at running away from bullies had paid off at last. Climbing onto the nearest windowsill, she grabbed the overhanging eaves. As she pulled herself up, grunting with effort, her legs swung freely until she could hook a toe on the roof edge. Another minute's struggle, and she had returned to her lofty vantage point, and found that she wasn't alone. A boy was lying on his stomach on the corrugated metal. At first, she thought he was dead. He was lying entirely still and didn't look up as she climbed next to him. Then she noticed the rapid rise and fall of his ribs. He was alive, but terrified. He looked a few years older than her, and as she peered more closely, she recognized him. When she realized who it was, she was tempted to pass him by, but something, Maybe the sight of a fellow human being among the chaos and slaughter made her pause.
Saul, is that you?
The boy's head lifted. His face was drained of color, but his terror-stricken expression faded at the sight of her.
It's you, I thought.
You thought I was a region climbing up to get you?
Yes. No, I didn't.
His pale cheeks flushed. He began to get to his feet, though cautiously.
Why didn't you run?
I didn't think you were a region.
She made a sound of disgust and moved to go past him. He was standing between her and the next roof, where she needed to go to get back to her grandmother. He grabbed her. His face was red.
I said, I didn't think you were a region.
Let me go. I don't care what you thought. I don't care if you're embarrassed about hiding up here.
She tried to peel his fingers from around her arm.
I wasn't hiding.
He grabbed her other arm and drew her close to him. She was so close, she could see the fine hairs of his pubescent mustache. She cursed to herself. Saul was the leader of one of the settlement's gangs of children. He had a reputation to uphold, and he didn't want her telling anyone about his cowardice. She regretted her unwise words.
I don't have time for this. Let go of me. I promise I won't tell anyone what you were doing if anyone's still alive after this.
His grip tightened. He drew her so close she could feel his breath, warm and moist on her face.
What do you mean? What was I doing? What wouldn't I want you to tell anyone?
Her patience was at an end. Unlike in previous encounters with Saul, he didn't have his cronies to back him up in a fight. She headbutted him. Her forehead hit the bridge of his nose square on, and the cartilage crumpled satisfyingly. He shrieked in pain and released her to grab his nose, which was leaking streams of blood.
You black-eyed bitch!
He made another grab for her, but she was already past him and leaping the gap between two roofs. As she landed, she staggered and slipped, but she was quickly on her feet again and running toward the next gap. A thump from behind told her that Saul hadn't given up on his revenge. The settlement brat was hard on her tail, as if she didn't have enough on her plate. She sped across the rooftops, but she had no time to take her bearings. She thought she was heading toward her grandmother's shop, but she wasn't sure. The sun and their sister planet were nearly overhead, so it was hard for her to get a sense of direction. And though she'd completed her share of rooftop journeys, this part of the settlement was unfamiliar. Saul was matching her speed, remaining a steady distance of roughly a rooftop away. She was struggling to maintain her pace. Her chest ached and her breathing was deep and rapid. She wanted to shout at him to leave her alone, that they both had more serious problems right now, but she couldn't spare the breath. Where was Nai's shop? Finally, she saw a landmark she recognized, the decorated gables of the town exchange, where farmers sold their produce to off-world traders. She paused. She'd come too far east, but if she turned at a right angle, she would hit the market within a couple of minutes. Then it was a straight, unbroken route back to Nai. The moment she took to calculate her new route gave Saul the time he needed to catch up. He must have guessed her plan, for he ran to block her intended path.
Get out of my way,
she said between gasps, her chest heaving. In answer, he spread his arms wide and beckoned with his fingertips. He grinned, cracking the dried blood that had run from his grotesquely swollen nose. It was no good. She would have to get past him somehow, even if it meant pushing him off the roof. She lowered her shoulder and prepared to take a run at him, but a dark blur rose above the roof edge behind him.
Watch out!
His grin spread wider, as if he thought she was bluffing, but something in her face must have told him that wasn't the case. He looked behind him. Simultaneously, the region fastened a claw around his ankle and jerked him off his feet. He fell forward and was dragged away. He grasped uselessly at the corrugated ridges of the roof. She leapt to him and snatched at his wrists. She had him. She resisted the tug of the region, and Saul hung between them. If only she could take a sip of elixir, she could cast. But to do that, she would have to let go of Saul. As his terror returned, he suddenly looked much younger than his years. He was inching away from her, and there was nothing she could do about it. He was crying and squirming in her grasp.
Kick it!
I can't. It's holding me too tight.
Pull up your knee! Climb back up here!
Tears flooded his eyes, and he shook his head.
I can't. I'm dead. Let go of me. Run. Save yourself.
She pulled harder, but his skin was slippery with sweat. He slid closer to the roof edge. Only his shoulders, head, and arms remained visible.
Let go. It's too late.
No, I won't.
Tears dripped from her chin. One of Saul's arms slipped from her grasp. She gripped his other arm with 2 hands, but a tug from the region below broke him free. He disappeared. She ran forward and looked down. A blurred region was carrying Saul away. She drew her canister from her shirt and took a sip of elixir before closing her eyes to make the cast. The strokes began to form, but before the character was complete, they faded. She couldn't stop weeping. Swallowing her tears, she tried again, and failed once more. She opened her eyes. Saul and the region were gone. Her sobbing broke out afresh. Saul had bullied her on more than one occasion, but he was just a kid. He didn't deserve to die. None of her neighbors did. Why were the regions attacking them? She had to get back to her grandmother. She leapt the large gap between the roofs and teetered on the brink on the other side. Then she was running again. As she sped across the settlement, she saw more and more of the regions had made their way to its outer reaches. They were searching the houses, sometimes going in the doors, sometimes crawling through the windows. Hidden children and babies were being found and carried off. The aliens seemed determined to clear the place of all humans. When she reached the shop, she caught a glimpse of dark blur disappearing through the curtained entrance. She bounded from the roof down to the dusty street, rolling onto her back to soften the impact. Before she even fully regained her feet, she was speeding toward the entrance, heedless of everything but her destination. How much time had passed since her last swallow of elixir? It had been so long, the effect must have dissipated. She pulled out the stopper from the canister and, in her haste, accidentally dropped it. She tipped up the 2-light container. Only one small mouthful remained. She burst into the shop. The front section was a jumbled mess. The region had overturned the desk and cabinets full of stones. Sliding on the smooth, shiny pebbles, she fell hard on her behind. The shock jolted breath from her lungs. A rustling sound was coming from the back room. She needed to see the region for the cast to work, but if she went in there, it would see her and catch her. She also had very little elixir left. If the cast didn't work, she wouldn't get a second chance. But if she didn't go in, the alien would find her grandmother. She thrust aside the inner curtain. The scalabite enclosure was overturned. The rug lay beneath the open trapdoor, and her grandmother was staring in terror at the alien towering over her, nearly filling the tiny room. As Carina watched, it reached in and lifted up Nai-Nai's tiny, frail form. The old woman had seen her.
Leave me. Run.
Carina drank the last of her elixir and squeezed her eyes shut. She would make the cast. She would make the cast. She wouldn't fail Nai like she'd failed Saul. She would rather die.
Please, child, go. My life is nearly over. Forget me. Your father's spirit wants you to live.
Carina felt the looming presence of the region. It was coming for her, too. One stroke of the character formed in her mind. A hard, articulated limb fastened around her waist. Another stroke formed. She was lifted from her feet. The third stroke appeared. Her grandmother was crying, a soft, reedy lament. The fourth and final stroke cut through the rest. She cast. She dared not open her eyes. She couldn't face her grandmother's look of reproach. She hadn't done as she was told. There was a thud and a cry of pain. Her eyes jolted open. She was in the front of the shop, and she was falling. She hit the floor and scattered stones. The region had faded and died, but Nai was hurt. Carina crawled over to her grandparent. The old woman's head had struck the countertop when the alien released her. Blood oozed alarmingly from the wound, and her grandmother seemed dazed. Carina wrapped her arms around her thin shoulders and lifted the small woman onto her lap. She took a corner of her shirt and pressed it against the cut, trying to stem the flow of blood.
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I disobeyed you. I shouldn't have left you.
The old woman's small, delicate hand sought out Carina's and patted it soothingly.
No, you were right. You killed the region. Your mage powers have grown strong. You did the right thing in trying to protect everyone.
She shook her head.
I tried, but it wasn't enough. There are too many of them. I can't kill them all. I have to get you away from here.
She was fearful of moving the old woman in her injured state, but their only chance was to try to escape into the wilderness.
Maybe we don't have to run. Maybe you can save the others.
How? I have to see the aliens to kill them. It's too hard and I don't have time. I'll carry you away. I won't ever leave you again, I promise.
You don't have to see them. Not if you're strong enough. I think you can do it. Take my elixir. Drink it all. When you form the character, send your mind out. Imagine as many regions as you can. Don't be afraid. Find your power and unleash it.
Carina blinked away the tears obscuring her sight. The old woman's gaze was steady and full of confidence. Maybe she really could do it. She took her grandmother's canister and downed the elixir in one go. It made her gag, and she struggled to not vomit up the disgusting liquid. With a final glance at her grandmother's expression, willing her to succeed, she closed her eyes. She drew the character. She thought of Nai and what the regions had done. She thought of Saul and the woman, man, and child she had seen carried away. A rage arose in her, and with it came a new source of power. Her heart thumped and her breathing sped up. Her anger threatened to consume her, but she didn't allow it. She took hold of her hatred and directed it outward, imagining the settlement and the regions. She let her cast fly, her fury bearing it along. It was gone. She collapsed. When she returned to consciousness, she was lying on top of her grandmother. She lifted herself up, horrified that she had hurt the old woman. Nai smiled at her faintly.
I think you did it. You killed enough of them to make them leave. Listen.
No more screams or shouts were coming from outside. The hisses of pulse rounds had ceased. The settlement was quiet. A sudden sense of alarm seized her. Had she hurt her neighbors as well as the regions? But then she heard voices in their street, calling the names of missing relatives and friends.
I think maybe I did.
You did a great thing. You killed the regions and saved us, though no one will ever know. Now I have a little more to teach you before I die.
No, please don't say that.
I am old. I have done my best, but you must learn to live without me. I am content. You are strong now. You will survive.
She didn't feel strong. She felt young and helpless. She didn't want to be alone, and she couldn't imagine life without her grandmother.
Don't worry, child. I'm not dying just yet. At least, I don't think so. Help me up. Let's fix this cut. Then you can tidy up the shop.
Carina rubbed her sleeve across her face and then helped her grandmother to her feet. Escaped scalabites were crawling up the old woman's pants. She brushed them off. The insects had to be all over the shop and probably in the Kruken station too. It was a shame she hadn't been able to save her pets, but she had more important concerns now. The end. This has been Daughter of Discord, prequel to Star Mage Saga, written by J.J. Green and AI narrated. The next book in the Star Mage Saga series is Book 1, Star Mage Quest. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com. Please like and subscribe to this channel for more J.J. Green audiobooks.